Hi, everyone. I've been wondering about aircraft carrier sinkings early in the Second World War. There were quite a few of them, and I was wondering whether the lessons learned bore out in the course of the war. I decided to look at Wikipedia. There's a web page that has all the aircraft carriers of the Second World War listed in it, and I decided to take the RN, the US Navy, and the Imperial Japanese Navy and take their data and put them into Excel. I created these graphs. I feel as though I learned something. So let's start with the Royal Navy. You can see here at the left-hand side, this is September of 1939, and here is September 1945, VJ Day. There were several carriers already commissioned in the Royal Navy at the onset of the war. You can see that only days into the war, the Courageous was sunk. And several months later, there was the Glorious, and then the Ark Royal, the Hermes, the HMS Eagle. There was the Audacity. I think it's pronounced Ariguani. I don't know. This is a spate of sinkings of aircraft carriers in the first few years of the war for Great Britain. Well, let's go on to the next slide, and that's the US Navy. So here you can see that the United States entered the war in December of 1941, and we had several carriers commissioned at the time. By the way, these subsequent lines show when each of the carriers that were commissioned during the war were commissioned. Here you can see that the US Navy had a very similar spate of sinkings. First the Langley, then the Lexington, then the Yorktown, the Wasp, and the Hornet. Let's take a look at the IJN. Here you can see, again, beginning in December of 1941, the IJN had a lot of carriers already commissioned. They had a spate of sinkings early in the war. I'll just go through the names. I hope I don't mispronounce them. Mizuho, Shoho, Soryu, Kaga, Hiryu, Akagi, and Ryujo. All three patterns have some resemblance to each other. Let's compare them now. Note that the United Kingdom was a combatant from the onset of the war. They had a few long years before the United States entered. They were fighting primarily surface raiders and submarines in the Atlantic. It was a slightly different war. The early Atlantic War was a little bit different from the Pacific War that was to come. Here you see a fair number of sinkings. They were building carriers, commissioning them. We had quite a tight spate of sinkings as the Japanese did. But one thing that I noticed is that by November of 1942, that spate of carrier sinkings seems to have stopped. That has got to mean something about lessons learned. I think it might mean something about logistics. Let's see if we can get into causes for some of the very earliest sinkings. This is in chronological order. Here, the HMS Courageous was sunk by a submarine off of Ireland. Here, the HMS Glorious was sunk by the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. So those were surface raiders. That is really quite a controversial engagement. Here, the HMS Ark Royal had been shuttling convoys to Malta, which was a terrible campaign. It was coming back from shuttling aircraft to Malta. It was caught off guard by a submarine. No ship goes down for nothing. I feel that the schedule that the Ark Royal had been carrying out, this just continuous back and forth, I feel that it must have had something to do with the fact that the submarine caught it off guard. The Audacity, which had been some kind of a German ship, it was captured by the British and they converted it into an escort carrier, and it was then sunk by Germans in the Atlantic on its way from the Mediterranean up to Great Britain. So here's the USS Langley. At that time it was a seaplane tender. It was no longer a real carrier. It was caught by Japanese air power, believe it or not, level bombers. And even later in the war, level bombers did not have a particularly good record with unguided bombs against shipping. Battle of Midway is a great example. The Betty bombers that took off from Java managed to jump the Langley and damage her to the extent that she had to be sunk by our own torpedoes. The HMS Hermes was off of Trincomalee in what was then known as Ceylon. The famous and terrible force of four carriers known as the WWII steamed a good third of the way across the Indian Ocean, caught the RN partially at port and some offshore. And as far as I know, this is the first carrier that was sunk by a carrier airstrike. Here's the Mizuho, which was also a seaplane tender. A U.S. submarine caught it off the shore of Japan. This, I'm sure, must have been a lesson. Here at the Battle of Coral Sea, the Shoho was destroyed, and the Lexington was rendered unable to fight and had to be sunk by our own torpedoes. So, what I want to talk about here is the lessons learned. So, here's a torpedo from a submarine. Here's two surface raiders. Okay, submarine. The Courageous really could have gone anywhere that it wanted to. It was on a hunting mission where the Ork Royal was saddled down by this mission, and its path was more or less predictable. So that's something new added. Here, the Audacity was with a convoy headed toward Great Britain. Here, the Langley was, it wasn't even really a ship of the age. It was very old, very slow, and its mission, I think it was to tend to seaplanes that were scouting around Java, the Celebes. HMS Hermes, this is the first time a carrier strike kills another carrier. Here, this with the Mizuho, you might say, well, it's pretty much just like the Courageous, but of course it happened on the other side of the world, and the two navies involved had not been involved in any of this, so that's something new. So here's the RN from the beginning to the end of the war. So again, here's September of 1939. Here's September of 1945. And here you can see the spate of sinkings up here. In the previous slide, it seemed as though they had ended in just before November of 1942. But here you can see there were two more. Some of these are very small carriers. Two of them were not actually full carriers. They were just seaplane tenders, right? But they counted as carriers in the Wikipedia page. And so I included them in the data. But certainly more than a 3x difference in displacement. So this is a wide range of carriers. And here you can see their commissioning dates. I realize that you can't see the names of the ships, and you can't hardly see the dates involved. But I wanted to show the whole Royal Navy carrier force of the Second World War at one time. And here it is. I think that they had so many carriers that by 1944, they decided not to commission some. I would have to read up on that, but I thought that there were some carriers under construction. Just decided that VE Day had become an inevitability by that time, and they decided to direct their resources elsewhere. And here we have a carrier that was commissioned just in the last few weeks of the war. Here's the U.S. Navy. Notice that there are so many carriers that I couldn't fit the date header at the top. And at the bottom, there are two or three more carriers down here that were commissioned in the last months of the war. And I just didn't have enough room to include them. There's the initial spate of sinkings that ended at more or less the same time that the spate of sinkings with the RN ended. But here we have more sinkings. Our Pacific War was a carrier war. It was a really intense and aggressive effort on the part of the U.S. Navy. So let's take a look at the IJN now. Here's the large number of carriers, the beginning of the war. Here's the initial spate of sinkings. And then they get a break. So I see this as like about a 6 or 8, I don't know, 6, 9, 10-month break. And then it's back to business. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's take a look at them all together and see if we can understand that. Here is the RN. And of course, they're, working on convoys in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, going after the submarine force and going after the surface raiders of the Germans. So here's the US Navy, which is going against the Japanese Navy. And when you look at the relative sizes of the two, it's apparent why the aircraft carrier force of the Japanese Navy was decimated. I think that these sinkings here are indicative mainly of aggression on the part of the US Navy. I wanted to know about lessons learned from this spate of sinkings here and this spate of sinkings here. What was learned? Well, let's talk about two in particular. Let's talk about that one and that one. A carrier called the Gambier Bay was part of Taffy 3. I believe that Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in human history. It was sunk by service ships, great big battleships, just as this was. In both cases, they were covering amphibious operations, was covering the evacuation from Norway. The Gambier Bay was covering the invasion of the Philippines. Glorious could have got intelligence that two surface ships were coming its way, two big surface ships, and that didn't get to them. Same here. The very, very large fleet of ships that had sailed through a strait on its way to attack the landing force in Leyte Gulf, they were turned back, they were attacked. Unfortunately, they were not tracked as well as they could have, or the information, somehow that intelligence of the fact that they turned around again, headed east, and were headed out to go after our landing force, that did not get to Taffy 3, which was a group of carriers and destroyers. Another thing that these two have in common is they both involved sustained attacks by destroyers in close quarters against battleships. It wound up to be practically a suicidal mission. I think in the case of Taffy 3, one or two of the ships survived that charge. In the case of the Glorious, the two destroyers were sunk. And in both cases, highly decisive damage was done by those destroyers against those capital ships. And it really did, in both cases, have an effect on the future of the war. I don't know that the lessons of the Glorious made it into the textbooks, but I think there's something about the aggression, the imperative to attack. I think that had a lot to do with it. When you look at this, and most of this, lessons had been learned, obviously. We had far more ships to protect, but they were being protected much more effectively. Were the lessons learned? I think they were. Were they subverted? Maybe so. Here's another look just to give you an idea. And note that a significant portion of the RN after VE Day sailed for the Pacific and joined the US Navy in the attacks on the mainland of Japan. They covered Taiwan. There was an enormous force of Japanese army still on the Chinese mainland. I'm sure contributed to some degree to this decimation of the IJN. I appreciate your time. Thanks.